Today's story is Mr. Putter and Tabby Spin their yarn. Let's go! Good neighbors. Mr. Putter and his fine cat, Tabby, live next door to Mrs. Tabby, T-Very, and her good dog, Jack. Mr. Putter liked Mrs. T-Very. She was a good neighbor. She made chocolate crunches and shared them with him. She made raspberry rolls up and shared those. She made brown sugar bonbons and shared those too. She was a very good neighbor. Sometimes Mr. Putter was not sure if he was a good neighbor. All he did was eat Mrs. T-Very's food. All I do is eat Mrs. T-Very's food, Mr. Putter told Tabby one day. I should do something nice for her. It happened that Mrs. T-Very and Zack stopped by later that day. They had just returned from the yarn shop. I am starting a knitting club, said Mrs. T-Very. We're going to meet at my house and knit. How nice, said Mr. Putter. Would you like to join? Asked Mrs. T-Very. No, thank you, said Mr. Putter, removing a shoe from Zack's mouth. Suddenly, Mr. Putter had an idea. Why don't I serve tea to your club? He said. You can knit and I can pull. How nice, said Mrs. T-Very. Can you stop in tomorrow at 2? She asked. Will do, said Mr. Putter, removing a glove from Zack's mouth. Mrs. T-Very and Zack went home. Mr. Putter looked at Tabby. We're going to be good neighbors, he said. Tabby poured and poured. The club. The next day at 2, Mr. Putter and Tabby went next door to Mrs. T-Very's house. There were lots of ladies there. They were knitting madly and talking loudly. Tabby looked at the needles and all the thread and all the big balls of yarn. Her teeth began to chatter. Chat, chat, chat went Tabby's teeth. This sometimes happened when Tabby was excited. She looked at the big balls of yarn spinning. Chat, chat, chat. Mr. Putter patted her to calm her down, but there were about 50 pounds of yarn in the loom. Patting wasn't helping. Everyone said a cheery hello to Mr. Putter and Tabby. Where's Jack? Zeke, asked Mr. Putter. I close him in the kitchen, said Mrs. T-Very. He was bordering Gertrude's head. Gertrude was wearing a hat with lots of fake vegetables on it. He kept stealing the potatoes, said Mrs. T-Very. Tabby and I shall keep him company, said Mr. Putter. Thank you, said Mrs. Tibby. "You're a good neighbor." That is just what Mr. Putter wanted to hear. The fun starts. In the kitchen, Zeke had found a bag of popcorn, a loaf of bread, and some marshmallows. He also had a fake potato. "Oh dear," said Mr. Putter. He cleaned up the mess. He helped Zeke unstick a marshmallow from his teeth. Then Mr. Putter made tea. He fixed a nice big tray with a teapot and tea cozy. He put sugar cubes and cream on the tray, and he filled a big bowl with chocolate bridge mix. Zeke and Tabby were very interested. Said Mr. Putter. He poured some cream in a bowl for them to share. Tabby pulled and Zeke wagged. It was time to serve tea. "If you're a good dog, Zeke," said Mr. Putter, "you can help." Zeke wagged again. Mr. Putter opened the kitchen door, and that's when the fun starts. One last potato. Zeke went straight for the head. "Eek!" screamed Gertrude. Zeke flew through the house with a big plastic potato in his mouth. Tabby chattered herself into a frenzy. Then she went straight for the nearest ball of yarn, which happened to be connected to a sweater Mrs. Fitzwater had been knitting for 7 months. Tabby flew through the house with the yarn in her mouth. As Mr. Putter stood in the doorway with his lovely tray of tea, Mrs. Fitzwater's sweater got smaller and smaller and smaller. Then it disappeared. When the excitement was over, Tabby and Zeke were long gone, and the loom had one less potato and no sweater. Mr. Putter looked at the knitting club. He put on his best smile. "One lump or two, ladies?" he asked. At first, Gertrude and Mrs. Fitzwater were too grumpy for tea, but Mr. Putter charmed them. He told Gertrude she had perfect taste in hat. He told Mrs. Fitzwater she was a model of goodness to cat. He gave them extra bridge mix. He poured them lots of tea. Mrs. Tibby stopped saying, "Oh dear," and the knitting club had a wonderful visit with Mr. Putter. By the time the tea was over, Gertrude had promised to make Mr. Putter his one vegetable hat, and Mrs. Fitzwater had promised him a sweater. When Tabby and Zeke finally came back, looking as if someone had knitted them, everyone just laughed. Mrs. Tiberi was so happy. When the knitting club went home, she thanked Mr. Putter. "You saved the day," she said. "Yes," said Mr. Putter, "but now I have to wear a baseball hat." "Oh, don't worry," said Mrs. Tiberi. "Zig will take care of that." Thank you for the watching. Bye bye.